I'd like to talk today about the media and warfare. We've been organising around Julian Assange, and I suppose the main reason that Julian Assange is in trouble is that there's the reality of warfare and what really happens in a war, and then there's the media picture and the picture that the people back home get, and the difference between the two, you know, what really happens and what we're told about. And Assange has been very important in breaking that barrier down and showing the people back home what really is happening. I think there's been in the last 100 years, there's been a creeping militarisation of society, starting with the First World War on from there. And one of the major players in that is the military's and the state's manipulation of the media in order to sell this militarisation to the people back home. You know, during the First World War, there was a massive outcry when conscription started, and they've actually got us to the point now where half the country's walking around with these Help for Heroes armbands, you know. So the military and the state are constantly pushing that message and trying to manipulate what we hear and what we read and what we see to get us to support these wars and support our troops. I suppose in the First World War, you know, while all that terrible carnage was going on and, you know, hundreds and thousands of people were dying in the trenches, the censorship was done at a local level. The officers in charge of each platoon would collect all the mail in from the soldiers and go through each individual letter and cross out anything that they deemed to be not suitable for the public back home. A lot of the newspaper reports at the time were heavily censored to make sure that the truth of what was happening on the Western Front wasn't being relayed to the public, you know, to make sure that there was continuing support for the war. During the Second World War, we had movie shows, movie newsreels and radio broadcasts. All of that, again, was heavily censored. What the people saw and heard was heavily censored by the government and by the media organisations themselves. You know, war sells papers and war sells movies, so it was in their interest as well to carry that on. During the Vietnam War, I think that's where we had a bit of a change, and I wasn't obviously not alive during those times, but I've read about it, and other people who were alive have told me about it. And it was the first time that the TV cameras were actually there. And because of the distance between reporting and broadcasting had shortened so much, it was a lot harder for the American government to censor things. So, you know, even people who weren't alive at the time have probably seen those shocking images of the children who've just been napalmed, the Viet Cong being assassinated in the street, and, you know, all these images that sort of come to mind from Vietnam. I think it's easy with hindsight to look at those images and think that these were the images coming out of that conflict, but I'm pretty sure that 9 out of the 10 stories that came out of that conflict were probably positive troop stories and positive stories about the war in Vietnam, why we were there, why the Americans were there. So I think it's easy to look back in hindsight and see it as stories of sort of a glory, you know, this sort of golden era of free news and free information getting reported back from the front. But I suppose the outcome of the war in Vietnam was that the military realised that this must never happen again. We must never allow the people back home to really find out what's going on in these wars. And if you go up to the Gulf War, the most recent Gulf War started in 2003, I think there was only 2 or 3 Western journalists who weren't embedded within military units. They saw everything from our soldiers' point of view, and they received all of their information from the military chain of command, and they were only allowed to go to areas where there was a good news story happening. You know, look at us helping out with these children or dishing out food, you know, never mind the destroyed school over there that we bombed earlier on, you know, look over here. And I think the military's done a good job of this news manipulation. My own experience when I was in the army of this was I was on the ground several times when the incident was later reported in the news. The first occasion was a riot in Northern Ireland, and we'd been out on the ground all day in this riot, and several things had happened, and then when we got back and saw it on the news, the story had been completely changed around. And I thought at the time, well, maybe I was in the middle of this riot and maybe I wasn't privy to all the information and couldn't see it from the bigger picture. But actually, I think that was my first sort of awakening to that the media had subverted and changed what had really happened on the ground that day for their own political means and for the government's message to get across. I remember flying into Macedonia, and we were supposed to be the first troops on the ground. And when we flew into Skopje airport and we got off the troop aircraft, there were actually more journalists on the ground waiting for us than there were troops getting off the plane. And you suddenly realise that actually this is just a big media exercise. The whole reason we're in this place is just a big media exercise, and actually we weren't actually there for any military importance. It was just a big PR stunt. I also remember being on at the top of a mountain in Afghanistan, and a CNN crew we were in charge of the security of the top of this mountaintop, and a CNN crew had managed to get up there. And I saw their news report later, and we'd been up on this mountain for a couple of weeks, and it was pretty quiet, and we were having a nice chats with the Afghans every day, and people were going past us on their way to work, and it was all pretty chilled out. And then this woman had got on the top of this mountain and put this helmet on, and there was some smoke, maybe a burning car in the background or something, and come up with a completely different story about how it was chaotic, and that the NATO troops are doing their best to stabilise the situation. Basically trying to justify our presence there. When actually, if we had cleared off at the time, I don't think there would have been much aggro going on. And then another occasion, when I was in Iraq, and we'd been sent on a combat search and rescue mission. One of our Hercules had been shot down, and we were there all night clearing this mess up, and we'd got back in and had a couple of hours sleep, and we were sent back out on the ground like 2 hours later. But because our chain of command didn't want the media reporting that there were British troops anywhere north of Basra, because we were up north of Baghdad at the time, we were given these uniforms from the Americans to put on, like to pretend we weren't British soldiers. So this box of uniform turned up from next door, and we're all trying it on, and I think they'd stitched us up a bit. They knew what was happening, sort of. I think my trousers got down to my knee, and some other guy had his jacket down to about here, and we basically looked like some sort of dad's army going out there, but we must have looked ridiculous. But as long as the media didn't realise that we were actually there, and this all covered it all up. So I've actually experienced this, these small things where the media is strung along, or actively colludes in this misinformation. When I left the army, I started speaking out against the war because I wasn't happy with my own experience of the war compared to what was being reported back home, and I wanted to get a message across of what was actually happening out there and what we were involved in. And the government wasn't too happy with this, and they took me to the High Court, and a secret trial, and they gagged me. And at the same time, an investigation was started, an internal investigation by the MOD to actually examine the claims that I'd made. And I was dragged into the Ministry of Defence, and they were basically fishing to see how much information I knew. And I was asking them questions about this investigation, and they said it was classified information, I wasn't allowed to know. And it turned out that the investigation wasn't actually an investigation into what we were doing. It was an investigation to find out how much people knew and how much information they would have to give out so that the story could be put to bed. So it wasn't a real investigation, it was just a sort of covering arses exercise. And I remember being asked in that interview, so Mr. Griffin, you've made these allegations, what evidence have you got? And I was sat there on my own in this room, and I was just thinking, well, what evidence do you want me to have? I wasn't taking photos and keeping a diary or writing in, using a dictaphone whilst I was in Iraq. What evidence do you want me to have? And I could see these sort of smiles appearing on these guys' faces because they knew I didn't have anything. so that they could get on with their investigation and put out the misinformation, and it'd all be forgotten about. And I think myself and other war resistors who've come out of the British military always come up against this problem. You know, we speak out and we try and tell the truth about what's happened in these places, but it's very easy for the government to then say to us, well, what evidence have you got? You're just a bad apple. You've just got a vendetta against us or your unit you were in. You know, what hard evidence have you got? And you have to admit, I've got nothing. I've just got my own experience. Well, we've got 100 blokes who say this didn't happen, which leads on to why I think this case against Julian Assange is so important. Up until WikiLeaks, all of us soldiers who were speaking out against the war had nothing to back up our arguments. And then the Iraq war logs were leaked, the Afghan war logs were leaked, and Cablegate, you know, the embassy cables were leaked. And suddenly all these soldiers have now got all this evidence that they can't refute. And it just takes going through all this evidence, and I found on the Iraq war logs a few jobs that I was involved in, and Kieran's, you found stuff about your actions in Ireland. So the importance of Assange is that even though he never was a soldier and he hasn't got any direct experiences, through his organisation and enabling allegedly Bradley Manning to leak all this information, it's given us all a lot of evidence to actually work with. You know, so it's a victory for the anti-war resistors, or war resistors. That's a double negative, isn't it? For war resistors, because this organisation has given us something to actually point at when we're questioned by the government or when doubters look at us. So just like to ask everyone here, if you're not busy on the 12th and 13th, to come down and support Julian Assange at the High Court. I've been to the High Court myself, and it's a pretty lonely place when I think Joe and Dave were there, you know, and maybe one other. And it really does make a difference. Don't worry too much about the outcome. You know, it's not called the Royal Courts of Injustice for nothing. You know, he's going to get... It's going to go against him, but what really matters is for him, as he walks in and walks out, and whilst he's in there, to realise there are people who are looking a bit deeper than just the charges up front, you know, actually looking a bit beyond that, and are willing to go and stand outside and support the guy. And I think that would really mean a lot to him if more people turn up on that day. Thanks.